Can you love yourself? Yes. Well, that's where the second dream that I had, the second NDE that I had, that gave me instructions about needing to clear the decks with this one person, and that's where self-love comes into play, I think. And that was a very clear instruction that came out of that dream. So that was quite interesting. But yeah, you come back to the other side, and you are changed. You are changed for good. And I have to be honest, I slip back, I backslide every day. I don't love everybody the way I am expected to, or need to, or was shown to, but I now have a template that rings true to my own life.
Dave Tabler is an author, historian, and photographer whose life took a sharp turn after a brush with death. A medical mishap led to Dave's near death experience. What was the one message that Dave received on the other side? The importance of love, authenticity, and purpose, he says. Join us for a discussion about the paths we take and the legacies we leave. Dave, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, tell us your story.
Hi there. Thanks for having me. First of all, it's great to be here. I'm Dave Tabler. I'm an author, historian, and photographer living in Dover, Delaware. And I wasn't always those things, and I didn't always live there. And part of the bump in the road story is how I got to be those things and how I got to live here. I started out as a photographer only. I majored in journalism in college. And when I got out of school, I had a very interesting project that kind of fell into my lap. I traveled around the South with two authors, and we did a book on the artifacts of the Civil War. And we interviewed a lot of Civil War relic collectors who are a quirky community of people. And so I learned a lot about dealing with museums and just kind of the protocol of talking to people about history. So I thought I was off and on my way, and I got very cocky and said, okay, I'm going to move to New York and set the world on fire with my photography. Well, New York City was and is a ferociously expensive place to do business. And so unless you are of independent means or you've got great connections, it's really hard to just kind of blow in out of nowhere and become an overnight success. And so I got kind of waylaid in a hurry. I didn't come back to writing about history until 2006. And I started writing a blog at that point. This was when blogs were still kind of in the new phase of things. But anyway, I got to doing a blog about Appalachian history. My dad is from West Virginia, and he had just written a memoir about growing up in the Depression, which was quite interesting to me, except for the fact that he did not want to mention the word hillbilly or talk about moonshine. And I said, Dad, you're talking about West Virginia. You've got to talk about those things. He says, no, that's in the past. I don't want to deal with those things. People will just assume that, I'm the stereotype if I talk about those things. So anyway, that got underway. And that was doing quite well for a good many years. And then about 5 years ago, I was diagnosed with prostate cancer. And they caught it early. And so my doctor said, don't worry about it. You'll have an operation. It usually is very slow growing cancer, and you shouldn't be at all concerned. We caught it very early. You're in great shape. So I went on to the operating table, and the operation itself seemed to be fine. About a week after I got home, I couldn't I couldn't urinate. They give you a bag to urinate into until your muscles kind of reattach and heal. But I kept feeling full, and the bag wasn't filling up, and I thought, what the hell's going on? Finally, I just couldn't take it anymore. I said to my wife, we've got to go back to the hospital. I don't know what's going on. Long story short, they had reattached my plumbing incorrectly. And so my lower intestine was literally filling with urine. It was not going into the correct drainage at all. And so the doctor later on told me that I had about 3 more hours to live before, the urine would have poisoned me. So they had me on the operating table a second time, and that's when I had the bump in the road experience. Near-death experiences, I had never thought much about them until that experience myself. And I started reading up about them later. And there's a lot of commonalities in NDEs, but I did not experience all of the typical things. You know, you hear about the light, the white tunnel with the light at the end. You hear about that. You hear about people hovering above their bodies in an operating room and looking down and seeing what's going on. I didn't experience either of those. I experienced, you know, when you're a kid, you have a black light, you know, black light posters in your room, and you look at your hands and your fingernails are all kind of glowy. So the dream state that I went to, or the state that I went into, I don't know, I wouldn't call it a dream, um, had that quality of light about it. It was glowing. It was not typical light at all. And I was in a space, some sort of a star field of some sort. And the first thing that I experienced, which I think is very common in NDEs, is a loving presence just over my shoulder. And whether you think that that's God or a guide, a spirit guide of some sort, you know, I think it just depends on what your own belief systems are. But the commonality is that it's a very loving presence. And immediately I felt that I was in good hands. Wherever I was headed in this star field, it was going to be a safe and a positive experience. So the other thing that occurred is that there's no sense of travel, you know, the way there would be if I was in a spaceship. You know, I didn't feel any sort of bodily movement of any sort. After a period of time, we came upon this ring that made me think of the rings of Saturn. And instead of rings, it was a Mobius strip. And so from far away, it was kind of these little fields of rocks or floating things. You know, it wasn't a solid band. Things were floating around. As we got closer, I noticed lots and lots of people in this Mobius strip. And they reminded me of the bobblehead dolls that you see on the backs of cars. These people were bobbling. They were somehow stuck in position in this Mobius strip. And all the people represented were all races, all ages, all genders. And they were doing things that all people of all times have done and will do. So here's a baby being born, here's someone dying, here's a farmer plowing a field, here's a couple making love, all the things that all humanity experiences. And what this loving presence told me, and this was all done sort of, there was no voice, it was just instant communication, mind to mind. But what I was told was that these people were locked into position by, again, depending on your religious view, either sin or karma. They were held in place by their own actions, and they were trying urgently to break free of these bonds, but they couldn't because they hadn't realized that they were causing their own bonds or their own imprisonment. And I was fascinated by the fact that this was a Mobius strip because this just continues generation after generation after generation. Okay, so that was the NDE. It ended right there. I had one additional one, which was an instructional journey telling me that I had to clear up business with someone that I loved. And so I'm not going to talk about the details on that, but it was very much, it reminded me of Dickens' Christmas Tale. You know, if you don't clean this up, you're going to regret the fact that you never cemented bridges with this person. The net result of all this was that as I was healing later, weeks and months later, I realized I have got to get back to my original dreams that I first had when I worked on that Civil War book back as a young 21, 22-year-old. And, you know, at this point, I think I have the experience in life that I'm able to actually do a much better job of being a historian and an author and a photographer than I ever would have been in my 20s, because I've got a life's worth of experience and perspective and confidence that I did not have at that age. So since my NDE, so that was about 5 years ago, since then I've written 2 books, I've published them already, and I'm just now editing my 3rd book. And these are all histories of Delaware where I'm using my own photography mixed in with archival photographs. So that's kind of the long version of my story, the 5-minute elevator speech.
No, that's there are a lot of really interesting elements in that. I want to go back to that sense of love. I had not an NDE, but a similar experience. When my father died, I was in Delaware. He was in Florida. My father was in Florida in the hospital. I was going down to be with him. And I woke up about 2 in the morning out of a very deep sleep. And I had this overwhelming sense of total love, unlike anything I've ever experienced. And I went back to sleep. And the next day I found out that's when my father died. But what's
At that
really
exact time?
interesting, that exact time, what's
Wow.
really interesting is the exact same thing happened to my ex-husband who was in Connecticut at the time. Same time,
Mm,
same experience.
very
And
eerie. Yeah.
very eerie. But interestingly, I didn't connect a lot of dots for many years. I kind of had the experience, but I kind of set it aside. And I know a lot of people do that with near-death experiences too, that once they have this incredible experience, they may not want to talk about it for a while.
Yeah, and that definitely rings true with me. I think one of the things that happens in our culture is that, first of all, we don't like talking about death.
Yeah,
People, they sweet talk it. They say, well, when you pass, or, he's on the other side, or, there are all these euphemisms that we use. We don't say, I'm going to die, you're going to die. It's just, it feels too abrupt and too harsh. But it's a fact of life. I mean, we all know that. But I think what happens is, it seems unbelievable to most people that you could actually experience these things. The reactions that I immediately got was, well, you were on morphine, so of course you're going to have hallucinations,
yeah,
or, it was probably just a dream. You were under drugs and you were dreaming, and that's that. But the people who go through these things understand quite clearly that this is not a normal experience. I know, obviously, I dream like anybody else. I know what a normal dream is for me, and this was so out of the frame of reference of that I'm quite sure it wasn't a dream. But it's hard to prove. I think the people who have NDEs where they hover above their own body and are able to report, well, I saw the surgeon put down such
yeah.
and such on this side of the bed. Those are much more credible because they can be confirmed by outside sources. But if it's just you reporting on something that you experienced, okay, fine, you had a weird dream, come on, let's move on to some other topic. So it's a
I,
struggle getting people to believe it.
yeah, no, our Western culture does not want to believe in anything you can't see, touch, and measure. And
Yeah.
yet other cultures around the world have a much more spiritual grounding where these things are talked about. I remember David McGinley was on the show. He
Mhm.
had a near death experience. I think he had more than one. Um,
Mhm.
and he talks about the fact that he never talked about it for a decade because it was so out there. And he's a pastor. He's an
Yeah.
interfaith spiritual counselor, but it was just too far out there to bring it into mainstream conversation.
My family is Presbyterian and very religious, and so I thought, well, this will be a great opportunity to witness at some of my family members' churches. And so I went to my sister, and she said, "Oh, you can't say that in church." And I asked her to. I said, "Why not?" And she said, "Well, it's just, And she changed the topic. So it was flustering to her. But yeah, and I also talked to the nurse that attended to me in the hospital. Said, "Oh, you should come to my church. You'd be welcome, and we'd love to have you." So I came to that church, and I talked to the pastor there about sharing my story, and also, he said, "Well, you can talk to me, and that we'll have a great chat." And I thought, well, no, that's not the same thing as sharing my experience with the congregation. But I could see I was being kind of railroaded off to the side there as well. So very frustrating. Yeah, people think. You're just you're kooky, you're out of your mind, you made this stuff up.
No, I
So
think the idea of seeing these people caught in kind of a behavioral loop,
mm,
a karmic behavioral loop, if you will, is really interesting because I think that a lot of us are stuck in these karmic behavioral loops because as a society, we're externally oriented. We want that instant gratification. We don't pause to be still and look within and try to understand ourselves. And I find it so interesting that when you came back, you did exactly that. You went within and you sought out what was authentic for you with the photography and the history. That's really a remarkable journey in itself.
it's a scary thing to do, because you get to a certain point in life and you think to yourself, well, I'm looking in the rearview mirror now. I've done whatever I'm going to do, and I've already set the world on fire or not. But the fact is, there are in American lives second acts, and I think because we're so youth oriented, there's this obsession with, well, you've either got to make it big in your 20s or you're done. That's it. You're just going to be something. You're not important. But I think a lot of older people have a lot to say. I was commenting earlier about this idea of having the experience, the maturity, the perspective, wisdom, if you will. One thing that strikes me as very true at my age, I'm 68 now, and one thing that strikes me as very true at my age now is that each of us has a unique story to tell.
Yeah.
And, when you say that to younger people, they kind of roll their eyes like, yeah, right. But it's true. I have a dear friend of mine who lives in Germany, and he comes over once a year, and we go out photographing things around my area. And he has a camera similar to what I use. We go out at the exact same time and photograph the same things. And then later, when we compare our images, they're completely different. I mean, literally, we took these images moments apart, but because each of us has our own particular view of the situation, they are indelibly marked as our photographs. And I think that's true in writing about history as well. It's a real struggle for me as a historian to decide what to keep in and what to leave out. History is all around us all the time, so there's never a lack of things to choose from. I've worked with a couple of editors in recent years, and some of my editors come from a traditional historical background, which is, the great men. It's men, and history moving forward all the time. Other editors see it as, life is chaos, things happen randomly, and it's amazing that anything ever, that A ever follows B. So it's really fun to work with different editors who bring those different viewpoints to the table. My own, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was going to say my own point of view as a historian probably lies between those two. I mean, I feel obligated to tell the great stories. Yes, okay, fine. But I also am really interested in the quirky stories that are kind of in the shadows that maybe other historians wouldn't explore quite as much.
I like the quirky stories. When I lived in Connecticut many years ago, I've always had an interest in old paper. And I met this gentleman who had all these offbeat things he'd collected over time, one of which was a tax roster from Milford, Connecticut from 1799. And it's one of my favorite pieces. I have it framed in 4 different frames. And it's fascinating. They list acres of boggy meadow, the number of cattle somebody has, silver spoons. It's a very different perspective on things. And I kind of like that. And I kind of like the fact that it's an original perspective. It's not one that I'm translating.
Yeah. How about that? Silver spoons. Well, that translate, if you don't have, if currency is in flux, as it would have been in colonial Milford, Connecticut, silver spoons are tangible hard goods. It's like bullion of gold. You can melt them down and go anywhere, and you've got guaranteed monetary exchange. So that makes perfect sense that would be something that you would guard zealously and hand down generation to generation. Very interesting.
I think your path is one. Well, I want to talk about getting older. I think getting older is great, and I think our focus on youth is just misplaced. There's wisdom as you get older, and I think I often look at our lives as the first half of our life. We experience all these things. All this crap gets piled upon us. Other people's expectations, the way we're supposed to be, what we're supposed to do, how we're supposed to think, And then I think the second half of your life is an opportunity for greater authenticity, to start peeling all that off and going back to, who am I really? What do I really want to do? And I think that's an incredibly important voyage.
I would totally agree with that. I think that, again, as an author historian, I have to be somewhat concerned about book sales because, after all, I'm trying to make a go of it financially. But on the other hand, I feel like if I try to mimic somebody else's book who's been successful, it's just going to be a knockoff. I'd rather tell the stories that I want to tell my way, and you either like them or you don't. And if you like them, great. And if you don't, there are plenty of other options out there for you. But it makes me feel better about being a writer when someone comes up to me and says, "I love your work. You really got me inspired to get excited about history." I had an eighth grade geography teacher, Mr. Jarbo, and I was one of the fortunate kids. I think being a teenager in school is always a challenge because you're kind of at that age where you roll your eyes over everything and, oh my God, everything is so boring and why do I have to learn this? But Mr. Jarbo was a born storyteller. And so this is the guy that I can really point back to all these years later and say, that was what got me excited about history, because he would tell it as though this is somebody that, I just met yesterday, and you'd love this guy if you met him. As opposed to, today we're going to study the Battle of Hastings, 1048, crash and burn. I think when kids are forced to view history as something that they need to be spoon-fed that will be good for them, they view it exactly the way you would expect. It's like, okay, fine, I'll take the medicine, but I'm not going to enjoy it.
But actually, it's so interesting because there is no one version, and there are so many emotional, psychological aspects of history that just repeat themselves. So, as the cliche goes, not to understand the past means you will not understand your future.
I saw a headline in the News Journal, which is the newspaper in Wilmington, Delaware here, recently, and the headline was, "Delaware struggles to find its cultural identity." And as a historian, that made me both laugh and cry, because Delaware has 385 years of cultural history. And so if we are struggling to find our cultural identity, it's just because we're not looking at all the deep well that is right there before us. So it's, I think this is where we have to, you talk about, if you don't study history, you're doomed to repeat it. This is where the older generation has to really step up to the plate. If the schools aren't doing it, then around the dinner table we have to talk about these things, and why is that way? How did that come to be? One of the things that I moved to Delaware about 14 years ago, and I was immediately struck by the fact that everyone here was then and is still obsessed by Scrapple. Are you familiar with Scrapple?
Yes, I am actually.
Many people out in the far west are not, but it's a big deal here. For your listeners and viewers who are not familiar with Scrapple, it is nothing more than a version of fried pork meat. And so you think to yourself, well, what the hell is the big deal with that? But the big deal as it pertains to Delaware history is it was brought over to Delaware from German immigrants fleeing the Palatinate region. That's in the southwest area down by Bavaria. And the 30 Years' War of the late 1600s had taken place. And so the people of that area were just decimated. They were kind of like the Gazans of today. Their entire countryside had been decimated. And so Scrapple is not just your regular pork meat. It is made from the least desirable cuts of a pig. Ears, eyelids, nose, whatever doesn't have a name like pork or ham goes into Scrapple. But that makes perfect sense. If you're coming from a war-torn area, that's all that's left. Everyone's already run off with the ham and the bacon and the pork. And so they brought that over with them, and they held on tightly to that. That was a really important food for those early German immigrants. Well, about a quarter of Delaware's population is of German extract. So it got passed down generation through generation. And people today here know that Grandma adores Scrapple, but they're not necessarily sure why that is. They just know that she does. But that's the background. It comes from those German immigrants from the early 1700s who came down here. And a lot of people think, oh, well, it must be named that from, because it's from scraps. But that's another interesting little story. I explore that in one of my books. The German immigrants did not call it Scrapple at all. They called it Panhaus, which translates as pan rabbit. And you think, wait a minute, rabbit? I thought this was a thing made of pork. Well, you know how here in America, in American culture, if someone says, I want you to try this new dish, and you think, that's an odd meat. What is that? And you say bison, or it's squirrel, or some unusual. Oh, it tastes just like chicken. Well, that cultural equivalence also holds true in German culture. So if it's a meat that you've not had before, oh, it tastes just like rabbit. So that's where the idea of pan rabbit comes from. All right, so how do we get from Panhas to Scrapple? Well, in Middle German, so we're going back to the early 1700s now. In Middle German, the word Kreppel meant a slice. And so the local German immigrants here in Delaware would go to their butcher and they would request a slice of Panhas, which would be Panhas Kreppel. And so over decades and then finally centuries, the S from Panhas and the word Kreppel got concatenated. They got smushed together. And I first stumbled on this whole realization. I was looking at newspapers from the 1860s, and they all have the word scrapple in quotes. And I thought, what the hell is going on? Why are those in quotes? And the reason is Delawareans of the 1860s understood perfectly well that the word scrapple was a bastard word. It was like saying FedEx instead of Federal Express.
Mhm.
And after enough time went by, I think by the 1880s, the newspapers dropped the quotes. And so we have scrapple as it is today. So
I think it's fascinating that your near-death experience brought you back to your love of history and photography. How else did it change your life?
one of the things that the spirit guide, and I hesitate to say God because some people don't want to, deal with the God idea, but the spirit guide that dealt with me made very clear to me that when I returned, love was the most important thing. And again, it's one of those things that we hear as a bromide again and again and again. But when you have experienced this outpouring of love to yourself, and you realize that no matter who you've been or what you've done or haven't done or did wrong, that you are still loved, that is such a powerful feeling. I don't think many people can really appreciate just how powerful that idea is. Again, we hear it taught to us as kids, you are loved. Okay, fine, great. But to experience is a whole different effect. So I think, to me, I realized that the striving that we do, and particularly in Western culture, I want to have a bigger car, I want to have a nicer house, I want to have nice clothing, I want to go on elegant vacations. The list goes on, and it never ends because our desire for stuff never ends. It's kind of the getting out of the wheel of karma. In the Eastern religions, we're caught up in this, and that's kind of where the little bobblehead doll idea was shown to me. It's like, as long as you strive for these things, you're going to miss the bigger point, which is that love is the key. Loving family, of course, but the more broadly you can spread that love, the more you will grow as an individual. It's easy to love your kids or your grandkids. They're part of you, but can you love your neighbor? How about the person down the road? How about the person in the next country? How about
Can you
around the
Yeah, can
other
you
side
love
of the world?
yourself? Can you love
Can
yourself?
you love yourself? Yes. Well, that's where the second dream that I had, the second NDE that I had, that gave me instructions about needing to clear the decks with this one person. And that's where self-love comes into play, I think. And that was a very clear instruction that came out of that dream. So that was quite interesting. But yeah, you come back to the other side, and you are changed. You are changed for good. And I have to be honest. I slip back. I backslide every day. I don't love everybody the way I am expected to, or need to, or was shown to. But I now have a template that rings true to my own life, to my own world.
How do you try to find that love when you're in a difficult situation with somebody?
Oh, that's an interesting challenge. And it is a challenge.
Yeah.
Um, how do you find that? Hmm. I think it has to be intuitive. I think I can't put a laundry list like, first I do this and then I do that, and then if that doesn't work, I do this. There has to be. I think one has to let one's guard down, meaning I have to let my guard down. But yeah, you have to relax into the moment and say, this person has flaws just as much as I do. They have people that, that care for them and that they care for just as much as I do. It's a matter of putting yourself in that person's shoes. And that's hard for most of us to do, I think. Particularly if it's someone who does not have your set of beliefs or, your view of the world, your take on the world. It's very hard to do that.
Yeah, I think it can be. I know for me, one of the things that I work on is being present. And like everybody else, I get lured down rabbit holes. I spent an hour and a half down an Apple rabbit hole earlier today. And yeah, and I didn't get resolved, but the people were very nice and helpful. But I know that because being present is very important to me, I am aware of when I am present and I'm aware of when I'm not present. And so when I'm not present or not loving, maybe, at least I'm aware that I'm in that state and I know I need to move to be more engaged with this moment. And I think maybe just the experience of those two extremes, like you don't know hot until you know cold. How can you know presence until you know lack of presence? And how can you know compassion, empathy, or love until you've experienced lack of it?
I started taking yoga shortly after my NDE, and that helped me a lot as far as clearing away a lot of the debris that stands in the way of being present. Focusing on your breathing,
Hmm.
and much of it sounds very woo-woo when you talk to people who have not experienced yoga or tried it. But even if you don't put yoga as a label on it, and you're not wearing Lululemon tights, you can still focus on breathing and just going inward and slowing down and observing how you are in a moment. And focusing on your breath really does that incredibly powerfully.
Well, it
So that
changes
was,
it changes your whole body. Your breath is an incredibly powerful tool in terms of
mhm,
managing stress as well as being present.
yeah, absolutely. So
I know for me, I think I've been meditating for about 15 years now. And
mhm.
that I think has helped enormously with working towards ever better presence, because it goes down to just awareness and mental discipline. I think mental discipline is a big part of it. If you can discipline your mind to be still, you can bring that discipline into so many other things in your everyday life.
That comes in very handy also as an author, especially in the early stages of a project where it's just me, prior to the editors and the publishers getting involved. It's just my idea. And I find that if I don't have that mental discipline, it's easy to dissipate the project and say, well, I'll do that tomorrow. And so over the years, and especially in the last decade or so, I really have a very structured routine in the morning. Like everyone else, I have chores, I have obligations, I have pressing things from the outside. And I deal with those later in the day. But in the morning, the first 2 hours before breakfast are mine. I get up very early, and it always startles people when I say this, but I usually get up between 4:30 and 5
Hmm.
because there are no distractions that time of day. No, there's no emails to answer, no phone calls, no texts rolling through. It's very quiet. And so I sit down, I have my cup of coffee, I pray a little bit, I read a little bit, meditate a little bit, and then I sit down and I write for about an hour and a half before breakfast. And once I've had breakfast, okay, fine, whatever needs to be done today, great. I can mow the lawn, I can go to the dry cleaner, whatever needs to be done. But those 2 hours are mine. And so, obviously I write, or not obviously, but I do write longer than 2 hours a day. But sometimes it gets broken up. I have to pause and go deal with a doctor appointment or what have you. But for those 2 hours, that's my focus time. And that structure really helps me stay on course, both with writing and also with just staying focused in my life. And that helps also later when we were talking about being present with someone. Once you have that kind of mental discipline as a regular part of your life, it's much easier to be present with people, to look them in the eye and not look away, and really pause and, instead of just waiting for them to finish so that you can say what you're going to say, really listening to what the hell they've got to say and then giving it thought and then responding. That's a lot of people when you're talking to them, they nod their heads and then they just say what they were going to say. And you can say, you're not listening. You didn't hear what I said.
Listening is a lost art, I'm afraid, and it's one we
Mm.
need to resurrect. You know, you in talking about love with your near-death experience, that is
Mhm.
a universal feature that absolutely, as far as I know, absolutely everybody comes back with this sense of overwhelming love, that love is the message.
Yeah,
Wow.
I'm not surprised by that at all. I'm not. Again, even if you're not a religious person, you are surely aware that all the religious texts of all the religions, they all talk about love. I mean, it all circles back to that, regardless of the names of the god or gods involved in the rest of the text. But love is always key, whether it's the Bible, the Quran, whatever text it might be. Um, I read a lot of Lao Tzu out of China, and
Mhm.
I'm always fascinated by, how he talks about settling the mind and just finding that quiet river flowing through you. And it feels so native to me, even though it was written thousands of years ago in Chinese. Of course, I'm reading the translation. I mean, I don't read Chinese myself, but um, it feels like it was written 10 minutes ago.
That's one of the things I think about some of the Buddhist precepts that appeal to me as well. They're timeless. And in that case, they focus on individual initiative towards being a better person, whether it's,
Mm.
through meditation, through presence, whatever. And I like that focus. Well, I don't subscribe to any religion. I agree with you. They all have these commonalities. And I like the Buddhist focus on the individual power to evolve and be a better person.
Well, and that ties into what we said earlier about the American thing of being obsessed with youth and that you have to make it as a young person. If you haven't done that, then you're a failure. It's just not true. There are many stages of life. Each stage brings its own joys and rewards, and I think we throw that away. You see this all the time with actresses, for example. They hit their 40s, and suddenly Hollywood doesn't want them. They're
Yeah.
too old to be the ingenue, but they're not old enough to be the mom, and so there's this zone in their 40s where they're just, what do I do now? I can't seem to get a break, and it's not their fault. It's the culture's fault for putting those false boundaries on people.
Yeah, and I think people at all stages of life we're all learning something. We're all evolving. And I think that to look at the world and say, oh, if you're over 30, you're over the hill, or over 40, you're over the hill. Oh, I just can't buy that at all. I'm 66. And I'll tell you, my life just keeps getting better and better. I love it. Yeah. I wouldn't go back in time for anything. I'm grateful for many things, but I want to keep exploring new things. And there are new things continually opening. I think it's a matter of just being curious.
Yeah, that's a real key. The curiosity factor is so critical. There will always be things out there that we could be learning or could be exploring if we're willing to, turn the rock over and take a look underneath. I think the classic retirement template in America is so problematic. You work for 40 years, you retire, and then you move to Florida and you play golf. Well, I don't like Florida and I don't like golf, so I don't want to do that template. But I think that template is loosening up a lot, and that a lot more people are realizing it's fine to go your own way and to explore your own paths. You're not the only person doing that, and you're not a freak for doing that either.
I think the retirement myth is a myth. If you look online, I've been looking into this a little bit lately. There are two primary archetypes that come up. One is a tall, silver-haired man, very handsome, very square-jawed, and his beautiful wife next to him. They're in a very affluent community on the golf course. Okay,
Right,
the
right.
the
In
other
Florida.
image in Florida.
Or
Uh,
Scottsdale.
the other image is somebody who's on their deathbed with scrappy hair and their arm is plugged into four different lines, keeping them
Right,
barely alive. And
right.
both these images totally miss the reality of in between, which is, I think more and more people are going to have to work longer. But I think that once you have that career stage under your belt, it opens up the opportunity to, as you were saying earlier, become more authentic, look at what really spins your wheels, have a second or third career, and one that really suits you for whatever stage of life you're in. And I think that that's a much more realistic model for what we're moving into.
I would hope so, certainly. I think people will be a lot happier if they embrace that concept a little more broadly.
Looking back at life, if you could rewrite your life, would you?
Oh, the big question. Let's see. Hmm. I think not, despite the fact that I had a lot of failures in my 20s and early 30s. I think there's a real temptation to want to scribble out those down dark periods. Um, the thing is, I learned from those. Um, as you were saying earlier in our conversation, you learn what the light is by knowing what the dark is. And if I had not experienced those things, I don't think I would have had as much gratefulness and appreciation. I'm at a fairly good place in my life now, but I wasn't always. I mean, I've been fired from jobs. I've struggled with hunger in my first year or so in New York. I mean, it was a hard time. Um, but those things taught me resilience. They taught me how to rely on pull myself up by the seat of the pants. I don't know that I would have learned those had my path been a little less harsh initially. So no, I don't think I would. I don't think I would rewrite things. Just like everyone else, there are things I think, oh, I shouldn't have done that, but I should have, because they led me directly to where I am now. So